Hey guys, it's Quinn, Cunniff, and Zach Clark from First Period Hughes, and today in a little bit of cram studying before the test, let's take a look at the politics during the Renaissance, most notably France, England, and Spain. Now this is chapter 13 in the textbook, roughly page 441, and quickly, because Mr. Hughes kind of made me, we're going to quickly readdress some of the major points of the last video and section. So in the Northern Renaissance, they shared similar concepts to that of the Italian Renaissance, but with a Christian spin on it. They want an ethical way of life, so they combine classical, which is Greek and Roman, with Christian cultures. With these two ideas, they admitted the faults of people, these are the main points, but said improvement can be made through education. Just to list off the people you need to know. Thomas More, who wrote the little gem called Utopia in 1516, remember that date, 1516, which featured social equality and stated that greed is the source of all problems. The way you remember that More wrote Utopia, just think. More wanted more. He wanted a perfect society, a utopia. Call me pretentious, I think it's clever. Next, you got Desiderius Erasmus, who believed that the study of the Bible will provide answers on how we should act. He wrote The Education of a Christian Prince in 1504, and more importantly, The Praise of Folly in 1509, which is basically a satirical piece. But it is critical to remember, he wrote the Greek New Testament again in 1516, the same year as Utopia by Thomas More. Just remember, he's religious. For him, he believed education equals reform and that Christianity is Christ. Make of it what you want. Okay, so after all that, here's the fun part, politics. Time for a tongue twister. As the Renaissance rolled around, rulers realized that they needed to be a sledgehammer of order. Violence went down, at least that wasn't caused by them. Nobles were kicked to the curb, and domestic order was made. These were called new monarchs, which occurred in all the major Western lands except the Holy Roman Empire because it was mostly split into principalities. So let's talk about each one. In France, after the 100 Years' War, Charles VII did much reform and quickly. He made two critical taxes, the gabel and the taille. I know I pronounced them wrong, deal with it. This is very important because the main source of income for the government until the 1789 revolution. He created the first permanent royal army, the first one. In 1438, he, at least in my words, attacked the church with the pragmatic sanctions of Borges. Again, I haven't botched it. Which gave the monarch control over the church and appointment of bishops and just general power. Now, because of this, the church in France will always have its actions dictated by the crown. It is very big and in my mind is similar to what Henry VIII did later. After Charles VII, you got Louis XI, the Spider King, who basically made the economy roll. He took the money that was earned and just invaded others. To remember him, you gotta remember, him and a spider, they're both pains in the ass. One later King, Francis I in 1516, yes, 1516 again, made the Concordat of Bologna, which is the exact same thing as the pragmatic sanctions of Borges. In England, there was a series of bad rulers, with the first real good one being Edward IV. His brother, though, Henry VII, is a bit more important, though. Like Edward before him, both conducted inexpensive wars, and by doing this, Parliament was rarely dependent on for money, so the influence of Parliament and the aristocracy was largely cut out. Henry VII instead used a royal council, a group of mostly middle-class men who served the crown more for the crown's sake than for personal gain. With Henry, they handled all three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. Judicial, if you remember, was through this Court of Star Chamber, which is basically a courtroom that had no jury but instead used torture. Hey! Henry VII, the Tudor dynasty, did not have a standing army, unlike the French, or a civil service bureaucracy, but instead used the justice of the peace, who were landowners that treated their area like they were Western sheriffs. Basically, they held the law. The upper middle class very much supported the Tudors and Henry VII because they brought this peace. Okay, Spain is just a section that repeats itself, so I'll make this as brief as I can, which isn't brief, but I'll try. Spain, even after this until roughly 1700, were pretty divided, but two main areas, Aragon and Castile, were brought together by the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella respectively. Once in power, they were pretty ruthless, first by bringing in the age-old Hermandades, who were basically a group of sheriffs in town, really brutal, demented sheriffs. If you've seen Tombstone, then imagine that, but more cult-like. See, Spain's already off on a good foot. And just like England, almost exactly actually, they made a royal council which was full of middle-class people. And just like France, but instead through Pope Alexander VI, they were granted the right to appoint bishops in Spain and their territories. They basically could make a national church, just like Henry VIII, not Henry VII, but VIII. And the pair were called the Catholic Kings of Spain. Now to backtrack to the ancient Ozark times of the textbook, Spain had been an 8-century-long so-called Reconquista to kick out the Arabs and Jews of Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella on January 6, 1492, finally ended the Reconquista by taking out the final Arabs in Granada, a principality in southwest Spain. Good for them, I guess. But in true Hitler fascist style, the people were still really concerned about the Jewish population, although Jewish people were actually starting to get along fine in society, getting great roles and jobs. The 14th century saw mobs and massacres against the people. Therefore, many were forced to convert, who later got titled conversos or new Christians, which are used interchangeably because they were still need to be discriminated against for some reason. So why all this setup? Because it's time for a question that will get asked on the test. The Spanish Inquisition. Because Ferdinand wanted to gain popular support from the people, he decided to attack the group everyone hated for some reason. Not because he personally had any problem with Jews, just so he could get more popular support. Yeah, remember, Jews in the past were seen as scapegoats for many different things, including the Black Death, and he wanted to capitalize on this. So after getting the thumbs up from Pope Sixtus V on September 28, 1480, the Inquisition began. It was basically a torture of all suspected conversos to admit that they weren't true Christians and then murder them if they admitted that they were Jewish. The same later occurred with Islamic and Protestant believers, but to a lesser degree. The rationale put up by the people was that Jews were bad people, so they needed to be ridden of. Isabella and Ferdinand in 1492, on a little side note, formally expelled all Jews from Spain, with 3/4 or 150,000 Jews deciding that this is the time to jump ship. One last thing, in 1580, Philip II finally unified the Iberian Peninsula under one crown, so basically Portugal and Spain. But this is kind of a void fact because they were administered separately. So with all that done, we can finally finish this chapter. Have fun cram studying, and adios.